My name's Pettifor, and I predicted the financial crisis in 2003 and again in 2006 when I wrote a book called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. And I'm the author of The Production of Money, which appeared this year in February 2017. It's a very lonely place being a woman in economics, and it's also a terribly boring place to be when you're on a panel with three men who talk endlessly and without any awareness of whether or not the audience is interested in what they're saying, and you're lucky enough to be able to be allowed to chip in every so often. So it's very tedious being a woman in economics. But I do regret the fact that there aren't more women, and the reason for this is that research has shown that if you get a group of young men together, they're driven by this hormone testosterone to take risks that women don't take. Research has shown that if you put a group of men together and a group of women together, the men are bound to drive a fast car and head towards the cliffs, right? Women don't do that. We don't do that for all sorts of reasons to do with our cultural, but mainly because we have to nurture the next generation. So we have learnt about caring. So if we had more of women, for example, in the City of London or in Wall Street, we wouldn't have traders heading for the cliffs and going over periodically and subjecting all of us to systemic failure. I'm very concerned about the Libor scandal, which is a horrendous scandal of the way in which traders in the City of London and Wall Street fiddle the numbers around interest rates, which inform the interest rates that everybody owning a mortgage in the United States and Britain has to pay. At the time, it was something like $16 trillion worth of mortgages were affected by whether or not the interest rate went up or down. And these guys were fiddling with it in order to enrich themselves and their companies. But when you read about them, they're a bunch of traders herded together in an office somewhere behind a screen, and they're gambling. They're doing reckless things, and their hormones are whizzing around at a fantastic rate. And the bosses are loving this because the bosses pick up the capital gains. And these guys are taking crazy, crazy risks, not only with their own money, their own lives, and their own futures, but also with ours. So we have a problem here. We have a problem with too many men, young men in particular, in our financial system, unregulated, unmanaged, left to do crazy things. And we have this delusion that they can be governed by something called the invisible hand of the market. What is wonderful about the Libor story is that we are told that interest rates are a result of the supply and demand for money, and that we can rely on the invisible hand of the market to get the balance right. Then we discover that there ain't no invisible hand. There is a guy plugging numbers in and manipulating this number, this rate of interest. And so, the delusion of the free market in money is a terrible delusion. It's a lie. And it gives these young men freedom to gamble, not only with their money, but with our money. So it's about time that we ended the domination of men in the finance sector and in economics, if only because then it wouldn't feel quite so lonely being on a panel with other men talking to themselves largely. So there's a problem with not enough women in the economics profession, but there's also a problem with the economics profession itself. It's a very big problem. The economics profession preaches something like Darwinianism in economics. So it's a little bit like they actually practice something called neoclassical economics, which is 18th century, 19th century economics, where in those days they didn't, for example, have a proper understanding of money and finance. And they also had a very crude understanding of how to manage society economically. That's still being taught in our universities. I'm shocked that even progressive economists like Paul Krugman believe that banks are intermediaries between borrowers on the one hand and savers on the other. Well, that hasn't been the case since the 1400s in Europe, but since 1694 here, when the Bank of England was founded. I'm a great admirer of an economist called John Law, who is sadly neglected, but who in my view is far more deserving of the label genius than Adam Smith is. And he understood the monetary system back in 1705 when he wrote about how to develop a monetary system. Unfortunately, his insights and his analysis have been forgotten, and instead Adam Smith's very primitive idea of finance is taught in universities. So women have a problem, which is that while they may be studying economics, they're studying this old-fashioned neoclassical economics, which is really not relevant to today's situation and explains why we've had recurring financial crises since the 1970s when neoclassical economics replaced Keynesian economics. I think women have to learn to be more assertive, and I've had to learn to be more assertive. I was criticised for my last TV appearance because I kept interrupting the man on the other side, but I've only learned to do that from men. And so I think we ought to give as much as we get, really, in that respect. But I think we're often far too timid and we're far too nervous about embarrassing ourselves or whatever. I think we just have to realise that these men who appear on these shows are often very confident and full of themselves, but really don't know what on earth they're talking about. But because they've been dominant for so long, they enjoy a sort of confidence that women don't. And it's based on flawed economics. And so we have to regain our own confidence and our own assertiveness and understand that actually there's a lot at stake. You know, there's not just our families and our society and our community, but there's also our ecosystem at stake. And the men that have dominated the economics profession and that dominate these TV shows are the ones that have led us into deep, deep crises. And we can't afford to have those crises anymore. You know, we really have to get out and stand up and have our say as women, because we need to transform this economy away from the corruption and the sort of incredibly endemic corruption that now pervades all the economies all over the world, from the United States through to Brazil, through to China, through to Africa, Europe, you name it. There are oligarchs, there are rich billionaires governing countries and looting our countries. And we're sitting on our sofas, minding our children on the whole, and worrying about our families, when actually we should get out there and start to demand answers, because unless we change the system, we're going to head into a very dangerous situation, which will be very dangerous for our children and our families. So women, we've got to get up and get out. The Financial Times tells you what's really going on in the economy. They have to inform chief executives of big companies who just can't afford to mess around with ideology. They've got to know what's really going on in the economy. I think we've got to learn to educate ourselves. And it takes a bit of practice to find your way around it. And it's a little bit, you may feel a bit daunted by it every so often. But it's really important, because there people talk about what's really, really happening, which you may not read about in your local magazine or in your local newspaper. And that, for me, is the best education. Because the actual economics profession and the current economists, there's very few that you can rely on. And there's even fewer who are willing to communicate effectively with the public. They all are up in their, ivory towers, talking to themselves and to each other, and very reluctant to talk to the public. I am, of course, a fan of John Maynard Keynes, who is described very often as a tax and spender. But that's how his enemies like to frame his work. He was deeply uninterested in fiscal policy, in taxing and spending. He said you should never have to solve your problems by taxing and spending. He was very interested in monetary policy. He was very interested in how to manage the financial system. Look after the financial system, he more or less argued, and the rest of the economy will tinker along on its own. And he managed the financial system. He introduced capital control. He insisted that credit creation should be managed and not left to anarchy. He insisted, above all, that the rate of interest should be low forever, because the rate of interest is highly exploitative of both of human labor and profits and so on, but also of the ecosystem. So he had these policies which he applied together with President Roosevelt after the war, and we lived through what economists call the golden age of economics for 30 years, when these policies were more or less fully implemented. Throughout that period, his policies were resisted by the private banking sector, even at the beginning. What's very fascinating to me is that at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, President Roosevelt insisted that there should not be a single banker at the conference. The finance sector was excluded. It was only economists from all over the world, including India and Russia, and third world countries as well as the rich countries. And the minute they agreed on the new financial architecture for stabilizing the global economy and moved away from Bretton Woods and went to Washington to try and set up institutions for it, the bankers pounced and tried to get the whole thing destroyed. It took them 30 years, but in 1967, 1970, they began to dismantle the system that Keynes had set up and which had given us a golden age of economics, of high employment, of sustainable interest rates, of no financial crisis anywhere in the world, if you read Barry Eichengreen. And since then, we've had recurring financial crises. We've gone back to neoclassical economics, and we have recurring financial crises that each time get worse and deeper and more profound than the previous financial crisis. And we're bound to have another one, because even since 10 years ago, we haven't done anything to change the system and to transform it and to restore it to the kind of balanced system that Keynes envisaged.